The train lurched to a halt with a violent shudder, metal screaming against metal, and for a moment there was silence, an unnatural pause where even breathing seemed forbidden. Then the doors were ripped open, and winter rushed in like a living thing, sharp and merciless. Jakob stumbled forward with the others, legs numb from hours of standing, boots slipping on a mixture of ice, mud, and something darker he refused to identify. Floodlights snapped on, bleaching the night into a cruel, artificial day. Shadows stretched long and thin, trembling like frightened animals across the ground. Shouts cracked through the air in a language Jakob understood too well. Orders were barked, not spoken, each syllable heavy with threat. Dogs strained at their leashes, teeth bared, their growls low and constant. Somewhere beyond the platform, a violin played, soft, almost gentle. The sound threaded through the chaos, making it feel unreal, like a dream twisted into a nightmare. Jakob's stomach clenched. Music belonged to concert halls, to warm rooms and applause, not to places that smelled like smoke and fear. He tried to remember when he had last felt human. The answer slipped away from him. Once, he had been a medical student, his days filled with lectures, notes scribbled in margins, arguments about ethics and anatomy over cheap coffee. He remembered believing that knowledge existed to heal. Standing there now, thin coat hanging from his shoulders, ribs visible beneath fabric, that belief felt childish. Dangerous. A guard grabbed his arm, fingers digging into flesh, and yanked him forward. Jakob barely had time to steady himself before he was shoved into a line. Faces surrounded him, men, women, children, each frozen in a different expression of terror. Some cried openly. Others stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, as if already half gone. Snow drifted down, settling in hair and on shoulders, melting slowly against overheated skin. A man in a black uniform moved down the line, gloved hand flicking left or right with casual authority. Left meant one thing, right meant another. Jakob didn't know which was worse, only that no one returned once they were sent away. When the man stopped in front of him, Jakob felt his heart hammer so loudly he was sure it could be heard. The man's gaze dropped to Jakob's hands, long fingers, clean nails, uncalloused skin. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What did you do?" the man asked. Jakob swallowed. His mouth was dry, tongue thick. "Medical student," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. The man paused, then reached for a piece of chalk. He marked Jakob's coat with a quick symbol, white against the dark fabric. Not left, not right, somewhere else. Jakob didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The man had already moved on. They were marched through the gates, the iron words arching overhead like a curse. The smell hit Jakob then, burning, chemical, sickly sweet. It clung to the back of his throat, making him gag. Barracks loomed ahead, wooden and endless, their windows dark like empty eyes. Guards herded the marked prisoners away from the main group, separating them with practiced efficiency. Families were torn apart in seconds, hands ripped from hands, screams swallowed by the wind. Inside the barrack, the air was thick and damp. Rows of metal beds lined the walls, stacked 3 high, each holding a human shape that barely stirred. The sound inside was different from outside. No shouting, no dogs, just coughing, groaning, and the faint rustle of bodies shifting in pain. Jakob felt eyes on him as he walked past, hollow eyes set in faces stretched tight over bone. Someone whispered, "Dr. Block," the words heavy with fear and something else, resentment, perhaps, or hopeless expectation. He was ordered to strip. Clothes that had once been his last protection were taken without ceremony, tossed onto a pile like rags. Naked, Jakob stood shivering on cold concrete while men in white coats entered the room. Their coats were clean, almost pristine, in absurd contrast to the filth around them. They spoke to each other in measured tones, discussing schedules, dosages, observations, never once addressing Jakob directly. One of them circled him slowly, eyes sharp and assessing, like a butcher inspecting meat. Fingers prodded his chest, his abdomen. Another forced his mouth open, shining a light inside, murmuring notes to a third who wrote without looking up. Jakob felt himself shrinking under their gaze, reduced to measurements and potential outcomes. A needle pierced his arm. The liquid inside burned as it entered his veins, a spreading fire that made him gasp. He tried to pull away, but hands held him firm. When it was done, he was shoved toward a corner and told to wait. No explanation, no warning. The reaction came quickly. Heat flooded his body, followed by a violent chill. His teeth chattered uncontrollably as sweat soaked his skin. Fever wrapped around his mind, blurring the edges of the room. He slid down the wall, knees drawn to his chest, trying to make himself smaller. Across from him, a boy lay on the floor, his body shaking even harder than Jacob's. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, eyes squeezed shut as if in prayer. Hours passed, or minutes, Jacob couldn't tell. The boy began to scream then, a high, raw sound that tore through the room. No one came. The screaming went on until it broke into hoarse sobs, then faded into wet, rattling breaths. Eventually, even those stopped. The boy's chest stilled. His eyes remained open. Jacob stared at the body, something inside him cracking open. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. The realization settled over him with a weight heavier than fear. He understood then that knowledge here was not meant to save, only to satisfy curiosity. That the men in white coats were not healers, but observers of suffering. When night fell, Jacob lay on a narrow bunk, fever still burning through him. Around him, the barrack breathed, hundreds of shallow breaths rising and falling, punctuated by coughs and whispers and the occasional sob quickly smothered. He thought of his old textbooks, of diagrams and Latin names, of professors who spoke about ethics as if they were unbreakable laws. He wondered how easily those laws had been discarded. As sleep finally dragged him under, one thought repeated itself, steady and terrifying: this place was designed not just to kill bodies, but to erase the meaning of being human. And by morning, he knew, it would begin again. Days lost their names inside the camp, dissolving into a gray sequence of pain, waiting, and observation. Jacob learned to measure time by injections and examinations, by the moments when the door opened and the men in white coats entered, bringing with them the sharp smell of alcohol and something colder, anticipation. Sleep came in fragments, broken by fever dreams and the cries of others. When he woke, his body felt less like his own, more like an object that had been handled too often, too roughly. The experiments changed without warning. One day it was blood drawn again and again until dizziness forced him to sit. Another day it was pills shoved into his mouth, chalky and bitter, followed by hours of nausea so intense he thought his insides would tear themselves apart. They recorded everything. Pens scratched across paper while Jacob shook, vomited, or lay still, staring at the ceiling, counting cracks to keep his mind anchored somewhere outside his body. He quickly learned what angered the doctors. Screaming was tolerated, even expected. Questions were not. Once, unable to stop himself, Jacob asked what they were testing. The room went quiet. A hand struck him across the face, hard enough to split his lip. Blood ran down his chin, warm and humiliating. No one answered him. He never asked again. The worst days were when he was ordered to assist. His chalk mark had become a curse. Guards dragged him from his bunk and shoved him into the examination room, where tables gleamed under harsh lights. Instruments lay neatly arranged, clean and precise. Jacob's hands shook as he was told where to stand, what to hold. He wanted to refuse, but refusal did not exist here. Survival depended on obedience, and even that was uncertain. A woman was brought in, her hair already gone, eyes sunken but fiercely alive. She met Jacob's gaze for a brief moment, and in that instant, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or a silent plea. Her wrists were strapped down. The lead doctor spoke calmly, explaining the procedure to the others as if delivering a lecture. Jacob understood the words, and that understanding made him feel sick. This was not treatment. There was no intention of healing. When it was over, the woman lay still. Jacob was told to clean the instruments. His hands moved automatically, scrubbing metal that would soon be used again. He did not look at the table. He could not. That night, he retched behind the barrack until his throat burned, then scrubbed his hands in freezing water until the skin cracked and bled. Still, they did not feel clean. Around him, people disappeared. A bunk empty one morning meant death or transfer, and no one asked which. Faces grew fewer, thinner. The boy who had slept near Jacob vanished after a particularly brutal experiment. An old man who whispered prayers every night was gone by morning, his blanket folded neatly as if he had simply decided to leave. The camp consumed people quietly, efficiently. Rumors crept through the barracks like ghosts. The war was turning. The front was closer. Guards were nervous, tempers shorter. The doctors, instead of slowing down, seemed driven by urgency. Experiments intensified, schedules packed tighter. Jakob saw fear flicker behind their professionalism, not fear of what they were doing, but fear of running out of time. One morning, Jakob was injected with something new. The doctor explained nothing, only watched closely as Jakob was laid flat on a table. At first, there was nothing. Then his chest tightened. His heartbeat slowed, each thud heavy and deliberate, as if his heart were struggling through thick mud. Panic rose in him, sharp and overwhelming. He tried to breathe deeply, but the air felt thin, insufficient. The doctor leaned in, eyes bright with interest, stopwatch in hand. Jakob focused on counting his breaths, on anything that might keep him conscious. He thought of his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread in the oven, the sound of laughter that once filled his life. He thought of lectures and notebooks, of dreams that now felt absurdly distant. Darkness pressed in at the edges of his vision, and he wondered if this was how it would end, on a table, reduced to a line in a notebook. He did not know how long he lay there. When sensation returned, it came with shouting. Not the usual commands, but confusion. Boots pounded outside. Gunfire cracked in the distance, sharp and unmistakable. The doctors exchanged glances, their calm slipping. One of them swore under his breath. Chaos spread quickly. Guards ran past the room, shouting orders that contradicted each other. Papers were gathered hastily, some burned, others stuffed into bags. Jakob was left alone on the table, forgotten in the rush. He slid off and collapsed onto the floor, legs barely supporting him. Every movement sent pain flaring through his body, but instinct drove him forward. By the time the gates were opened, the camp was a strange, suspended place. No orders, no structure. Prisoners emerged cautiously from barracks, blinking in disbelief. Soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms appeared, their faces a mixture of shock and horror as they took in what surrounded them. Liberation did not arrive with cheers. It arrived with silence. Jakob stood among the survivors, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, feeling hollow. Freedom felt unreal, like another experiment designed to observe his reaction. He watched as bodies were counted, as the dead were acknowledged too late. He searched faces for those he had known and found almost none. In the weeks that followed, Jacob's body began to heal, but his mind did not follow. At night, he woke sweating, heart racing, convinced he was still on the table, still being watched. The smell of disinfectant made him nauseous. The sight of a white coat sent a jolt of fear through him that he could not control. Years later, when people asked him to speak, to explain how such things could happen, Jakob struggled for words. He could describe the procedures, the methods, the notes taken with clinical precision. But those details felt insufficient. The true horror, he knew, was not only in what was done to bodies but in how easily compassion,